The sun broke over the Llano Estacado like a raw wound, bleeding red light across a land that was all horizon and hostility. Wind, the plains' only true resident, scoured the dirt, whining through the spines of Ocotillo and tumbling sagebrush skeletons toward Mexico. A herd of pronghorn, fluid as water, flowed over a distant swell in the earth and vanished from the shelter of a shallow arroyo. A young woman watched them go. Her name was Naya. She was still a part of the landscape, her dark eyes missing nothing. The wind told her a dry day was coming. The tracks in the dust near her moccasins told her the antelope had passed in a hurry, their hooves sharp and panicked. Something had spooked them, something other than her. She rose in a single, silent motion. She was lean and tall for a Comanche woman, built of the land's hard patience. Around her neck, a string of blue glass beads caught the morning's first light, a sliver of impossible sky against the sun-darkened skin of her throat. They had been her father's, Black Eagle, a man who had walked two worlds and found himself welcome in neither. He had been a warrior, then a scout for the blue-coat soldiers, an interpreter who had tried to speak peace into the chasm between peoples. But betrayal had been the only word they learned to speak back. So he had left, vanishing into the canyons with a promise of return that he never kept. All he left behind were these beads and a story of gold hidden near a place marked by a spring on a scrap of deerskin. Naya pulled the deerskin from a pouch at her belt. It was soft with use. The drawing faded but clear in her mind's eye. The gold was not for her. It was a debt, a ransom for the future of her people, who were being squeezed from their lands, their lives shrinking with every new fence post and railroad tie. Her father had meant for the gold to buy back a piece of what was stolen, a patch of earth where they could live, not merely survive. She folded the map, the weight of that purpose settling over her as it did every morning. Today, she needed a guide. The map showed the destination, the Two Ravens Canyon, but the journey there was a maze of shifting allegiances and sudden violence. To travel it alone was to invite death, and the only place to find a guide who knew the territory and could be bought was in a town. Palo Duro rose from the plains like a fever dream, a raw collection of unpainted lumber and adobe sweating under the Texas sun. It was a place Naya despised, a place that smelled of stale beer, greed, and a deep, abiding hatred for her kind. She tethered her pinto in a livery that charged twice the honest rate, the stable hand's eyes lingering on her with a look she knew well. It was a look that stripped her down to a savage, a thief, a thing to be used or destroyed. She ignored him, her face a calm mask, and paid the man his coin. She moved through the town's main street with a hunter's quiet tread, keeping to the shadows of the wooden awnings. Men stopped their conversations to watch her pass. Women pulled their children closer. The stairs were a physical weight, a constant pressure. She was looking for a certain kind of man, someone whose loyalty was for sale but whose skills were not in question. She scanned the faces of the men loafing outside the saloon, the ones playing cards on a barrel, the tired freighters loading their wagons. She felt the shift in the air before she saw the danger. It was the way two men detached themselves from the saloon's porch, their movements too casual. One was a big man with a red, blotchy face and a dusty bowler hat. The other was wiry, a rat-faced man with a nervous twitch in his eye. They did not look at her directly, but their paths were set to intercept hers at the mouth of the alleyway just ahead. Naya's hand went to the knife at her belt. She could fight. Her father had taught her well, but not here, not in the open, where the town's law, such as it was, would see only one side. She quickened her pace, intending to pass the alley before they could reach it. But they were faster. The big man stepped in front of her, blocking her way. He smiled, a slow, unpleasant spreading of his lips. "Well now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Look what we got here. McKendry, a pretty little thing, all alone." The smaller man, McKendry, moved to her side, cutting off her retreat. "She's the one Beckett described. Look at the beads." His eyes fixed on the necklace. Naya's blood ran cold. Silas Beckett. The name was a poison whispered on the wind. A land baron who bought politicians and swallowed ranches. His railroad tracks a steel cage closing around the territory. What business could he have with her or her father's memory? "The necklace," the big man said, reaching for it. "Hand it over. And the map you're carrying. We know you have it." Naya jerked back, her knife clearing its sheath in a flash of steel. "You will not touch it." The big man laughed. "Feisty. I like that." He took another step, his bulk crowding her. The alley was a trap. There was nowhere to run. Then, a flicker of blinding light erupted from across the street. It hit the big man square in the eyes. He roared in surprise and pain, stumbling back, his hands flying to his face. What in the devil? McKendry spun around, his hand dropping to his pistol, trying to find the source of the flash. Naya's eyes darted across the street. A man leaned against the wall of the assayer's office, a small mirror held in his palm, angling the sun. He was dressed in worn denims and a faded blue shirt, a former cavalryman by the look of his bearing. Though his clothes were those of a civilian scout, he was lean, his face weathered by the sun, a mix of Irish angles and the dark, steady gaze of his Mexican heritage. He met Naya's eyes for a fraction of a second, then gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the dark opening of a drainage ditch that ran beneath the boardwalk. It was her only chance. While McKendry was still squinting against the light, Naya moved. She drove the pommel of her knife into the big man's stomach as he staggered, doubling him over with a grunt. She did not wait for his recovery. She dove, scrambling into the foul darkness of the drainage ditch. It was narrow and choked with filth, but it was cover. She crawled through the suffocating space, the sounds of shouting and cursing fading behind her. She emerged 100 yards down the street, behind the blacksmith's shop, covered in grime but free. She found him waiting for her in the scrub behind the town, away from the main trails. He was cleaning the small signal mirror with a piece of cloth, his movements calm and efficient. His horse, a sturdy buckskin, stood nearby, ground-hitched and patient. Naya approached with caution, her knife still in her hand. She stopped a dozen paces away, her body coiled, ready. "They wanted this," she said, her voice low. Her hand touched the blue beads at her throat. The man finished polishing the mirror and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He was wary. She could see that. His eyes took in her stance, the knife, the tension in her shoulders. He was a man who understood threats. "I know," he said. His voice was quiet, with a slight rasp. "Men like that always want what does not belong to them. My name is Elias Quinn." Naya did not offer her name in return. Trust was a currency she did not possess, especially not for a white man, no matter his ancestry. "Why did you help me?" Elias shrugged, a gesture that seemed to hold a world of weariness. "I do not like the odds of 2 against 1, especially when the 2 are McKendry and his partner. They work for Silas Beckett." He paused, his gaze dropping from her face to the necklace. He went still. The air between them thickened. It was not the avarice she had seen in McKendry's eyes, but something else. Recognition. A deep, troubled shock that seemed to pull the breath from his lungs. "Where did you get those beads?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Naya's grip tightened on her knife. "They were my father's." "Your father," Elias repeated slowly. He looked up, his eyes searching her face, truly seeing her for the first time. "I saw a man wear a string of beads just like that. Years ago. A Comanche scout. He led a charge to free a group of Kiowa prisoners the army was going to let hang. He rode straight into the guns, created a diversion so the women and children could get away. His name was Black Eagle." Naya stared at him, stunned into silence. Few people in this world remembered her father for his courage. They remembered him only for the work he did for the army, for the betrayal they imagined he had committed. Elias saw the look on her face, and a kind of sad understanding dawned in his eyes. "I was a scout with that patrol," he said. "I was supposed to be tracking those people. I never forgot him. I never forgot the debt I owed him for showing me what a man is supposed to do when things are wrong." He carried his own burden. She could see it now. A deep shame that lived behind his eyes. He had been part of something that had violated the land and its people. A railroad survey that had carved up ancestral territories. He was a man looking for a way to balance the scales. Naya remained cautious. Her suspicion a shield she had carried for too long to simply set aside, but his words had found a crack in it. He knew her father, not as a traitor, but as a hero. He knew the meaning of the beads. "I am looking for a guide," she said, the words coming out clipped and reluctant. Elias held her gaze. He knew what she was not saying. She was on a quest, a dangerous one, and the men in the alley were only the beginning. Beckett wanted what she had, and Beckett did not stop until he possessed whatever he desired. He saw the piece of deerskin tucked in her belt, a map. It all connected. Black Eagle's gold. It was not a myth after all. "The trail you are on," Elias said, his voice grave, "is not a safe one. Beckett is buying up the entire valley. He thinks your father's gold will give him the power to do it." "It is not his to take," Naya said, her voice fierce with a loyalty that ran deeper than rock. Elias nodded slowly. He looked from the blue beads to the open, unforgiving plains that stretched out around them. He could turn and ride away. He could forget he ever saw her, forget the ghost of a debt to a brave man. Or he could do what he should have done years ago. He could finally choose the right side. "You are right," he said. "It is not. Where are you going?" "To Raven's Canyon," she answered, watching him, testing him. A long silence passed between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind. Naya felt the weight of her father's words in her memory, a warning he had given her before he left for the last time. The gold could be a curse. It could draw the worst kind of men, men who would kill for it. She was standing in front of a stranger, a man whose past was entangled with the very forces that had driven her father away. Yet he had saved her, and he remembered Black Eagle's honor. The setting sun cast their long shadows across the red dirt. In the distance, the lights of Palo Duro began to flicker, a fragile constellation of greed in the vast and gathering dark. Naya knew she could not go back there, and she was not sure she could go forward alone. For the first time, she felt the chilling possibility that the gold might be a curse after all, a stone that would drown her and the memory of her father in a river of blood. Elias Quinn stood before her, a choice she did not want to make, a risk she might have to take. The journey had just begun, and already it was steeped in the complexities of old debts and new dangers. They rode south, keeping the sun on their left, a silent agreement passing between them that the open plains were safer than the choked confines of the town. For 2 days, they spoke little, conserving breath and energy. Elias Quinn was a quiet man by nature, and Naya was a woman who had learned that silence was a shield. They communicated through action. When her pinto went lame, he was the one who spotted the stone wedged in its hoof. When his water ran low, she led him to a seep spring hidden in a crease of rock, a place no white man would ever find. A cautious respect began to grow in the space between them, a respect born of competence. They struck the goodnight-loving trail by the 3rd day, a wide, scarred road beaten into the earth by the hooves of 1,000,000 cattle. It led them to a lone adobe way station, a squat, mud-brick building shimmering in the heat. It was a place for thirsty men and tired horses. The proprietor was a man named Jedediah, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and his hands thick with the calluses of a hard life. Jedediah was short a half-dozen longhorns, spooked by a thunderstorm the night before. He offered them a hot meal and fresh water for their canteens if they could be found. Elias looked at Naya. She gave a single, curt nod, while Elias set to work on a ripped saddle left behind by another traveler, its owner too drunk or too weary to care. Naya rode out. She did not ask where the cattle were last seen. She did not need to. She read the story in the trampled earth, the broken mesquite, the direction of the lingering fear in the air. She returned before noon, the missing cattle trotting placidly before her. Jedediah grunted his approval, ladling thick stew into their bowls. Inside the cool, dim interior of the station, other men sat nursing drinks, their talk a low murmur. The words that floated over were of land and steel, a spur line. One man said, the railroad was building a new spur line. Silas Beckett was behind it. It would cut straight through the last of the free Comanche territory. Another man, a freighter with a whip-scarred cheek, laughed without humor. He said Beckett was already selling mining rights to land he did not even own yet. He said Beckett claimed he had a guarantee, a sure thing. Naya's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She felt Elias go still beside her. The casual talk was a death knell for the land she was trying to save. McKendry walked in then. He moved with a lazy arrogance, his rat-like eyes scanning the room. He did not seem to notice them at first. He ordered a whiskey, his gaze sweeping over the patrons. Then his eyes found Naya. They stopped. They narrowed, fixing on the blue glass beads at her throat. A flicker of triumph, ugly and possessive, crossed his face. He said nothing. He simply finished his drink in one swallow, tossed a coin on the bar, and walked back out into the blinding sun. A cold dread settled in Naya's stomach. They were being hunted. They left as soon as Elias finished his repair, the stitches on the saddle neat and strong. He had earned them 2 full canteens and a bag of jerky. They rode hard, pushing their horses, putting distance between themselves and the station, but the plains offered nowhere to hide. The sky began to change in the late afternoon. The brilliant, unforgiving blue bled into a sickly yellow gray at the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying a fine grit that stung their eyes and coated their tongues. A dust storm was coming. Elias pointed toward a line of low bluffs. It was their only hope for shelter. They reached the rock overhang just as the world dissolved. A solid wall of red dust descended upon them, a roaring, suffocating beast. The sun vanished. The air grew thick and choked with dirt. It was impossible to see, impossible to breathe. They huddled deep in the shallow shelter, their horses pressed close for comfort. Their tails turned to the howling wind. Night fell, but the darkness was absolute, unchanged from the brown gloom of the storm. They built a small fire from the bits of dry scrub Elias had the foresight to gather. It was a tiny island of light and warmth in the vast, roaring darkness. The wind shrieked around the rocks, a sound like 1,000 angry spirits. In the flickering light, Elias looked at Naya. Her face was calm, but her eyes held the storm's reflection. He asked her about her father. He asked why he would hide gold, why a man like Black Eagle would put his faith in the white man's metal. Naya was silent for a long time, listening to the wind. Then she began to speak, her voice low, a counterpoint to the storm's fury. She told him her father had not been a traitor. He had been a man trying to build a bridge that no one wanted to cross. He scouted for the army because he believed he could guide them away from conflict, show them paths that would not lead to bloodshed. And he talked with his own leaders, trying to convince them that the world was changing, that the old ways were being washed away by a tide of new people. She said they called him a traitor for it, the soldiers, because he would not lead them to surprise attacks on sleeping villages. His own people, because he spoke the language of their enemies and accepted their pay. He was hunted by both sides, a man without a people, without a home. The gold, she explained, was his last desperate hope. He had seen the treaties broken, the promises turned to dust. He saw his people herded onto barren land where nothing grew, where the water was poison. He did not gather the gold for riches. He gathered it to buy back a piece of their life, a small valley with a clean river and good grass, a place where the children would not starve. He had told her where he hid it, giving her the map. It was his last act as a father, placing a terrible burden on her shoulders. Her voice trembled as she recalled his last words to her. The memory was as clear as the blue beads she wore. He had held her face in his hands, his eyes full of a sorrow she was only now beginning to understand. He told her, "If you have to choose between the gold and the people, choose the people. Always. The gold is just dirt. The people are the soul." When she finished, the only sound was the fire and the unending howl of the wind. Elias said nothing. He simply watched her, his face etched with a profound sorrow. He understood the weight she carried. It was the weight of a dying world, a world he himself had helped to kill. The storm blew itself out by morning. It left behind a world remade, every surface coated in a fine layer of red dust. The air was clean and cool. A fragile peace lay over the land. As Naya tended to the horses, Elias scouted the area around their shelter. He returned after a short while, his face grim. He knelt in the dust before her and pointed. There, clear as a brand, was the track of a shod horse. The print was distinctive. The left front shoe had a small chip, a tiny imperfection on its outer edge. Naya's heart went cold. It was a tracker's signature, a sign left by a man too arrogant or too certain of his prey to bother hiding his passage. It was McKendry. He had followed them through the storm. He was close. She looked at Elias, her decision made in an instant. This was her fight, her burden. She could not ask another person to die for it. She told him she would go on alone. She said he had helped her, and she was grateful. But his debt to her father was paid. McKendry was her shadow to carry, not his. Elias looked at her, his dark eyes steady. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. The weariness was gone from his face, replaced by a hard resolve. He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. He told her, "I owe a debt to a man who wore beads like that." He said he had spent years running from that debt, telling himself there was nothing he could do. He had been wrong. He said, "Let me pay it the right way. Let me help you see this through." Naya looked at him, at the sincerity etched into the lines of his face, at the unwavering conviction in his eyes. Her father had told her to choose the people over the gold. For years, she thought he meant their people, the Comanche, but standing there, under the clean, washed sky, she wondered if he had meant something more, that in the end, all you had was the person standing beside you, the one willing to face the storm with you. The deerskin map felt heavy in her pouch, a trust that could no longer be carried alone. She gave him a slow nod. They would ride together. They followed the Canadian River north, a sluggish artery of red water moving through a parched land. The river was a fickle provider. In places it offered a clear path, its current a helping hand. In others, it coiled and twisted, carving treacherous whirlpools that could snatch a horse and rider and pull them under into its suffocating, muddy embrace. They found the remains of a flat-bottomed raft caught in some reeds, its timbers bleached by the sun. It took them half a day to make it seaworthy again, replacing rotten planks with scavenged cottonwood and binding the frame with strips of wet rawhide that would shrink and tighten as they dried. The work was done with few words, a shared rhythm of effort building a fragile bridge of reliance between them. Naya knew the ways of the river, where the current was deepest, where the sandbars hid just beneath the surface. Elias knew the mechanics of leverage and tension, his hands strong and sure as he knotted the ropes. They poled the clumsy craft through the water, the sun a hammer overhead. It was slow, grueling work, but it saved the horses and left fewer tracks. They passed a narrow canyon where the water quickened, spinning into a vortex of angry, churning water. Elias dug his pole deep into the riverbed, his muscles straining as he fought to keep them from being drawn into the spiral. Naya used her own pole as a rudder, her small frame braced against the current's pull, her face a mask of concentration. For a long, breathless minute, they were motionless, caught between the river's will and their own. Then, with a great, shuddering groan, the raft broke free and slipped past the danger into calmer water. They did not speak of it afterward. They simply shared a look, a mutual acknowledgement of the death they had just sidestepped. Further on, they spotted men on the bank, a rough-looking crew with more guns than sense, watching a herd of stolen horses. They hugged the far side of the river, letting the current carry them silently behind a screen of willows. The danger was constant, a low hum beneath the sound of the wind and the water. The land did not care if they lived or died, and the men who roamed it were often no different. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The landscape grew harsher, the trees more sparse. They came upon a place that felt different, a former plantation set back from the river, its adobe walls crumbling but its heart still beating. A small, well-tended garden grew within a protective wall, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a chimney. This was the supply post run by the widow, Maria Luz. She was a Kiowa woman, her face a beautiful testament to the sorrows and joys she had lived through. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. She greeted them with a quiet dignity, offering water for them and their horses without question. As Naya dismounted, the sunlight caught the blue glass beads at her throat. Maria Luz froze, her hand flying to her mouth. A flood of emotion washed over her face. Recognition, grief, and a fierce, protective gratitude. "Black Eagle," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the necklace. She looked up at Naya, truly seeing the daughter in the lines of the father's face. "You are his child." That evening, inside the cool adobe walls, as the smell of roasting corn and chili filled the air, Maria Luz told them her story. Years ago, she and her children had been captured by a militia, destined for a rope or worse. Black Eagle, scouting for the army at the time, had found them. He had not led the soldiers to them. Instead, he had created a diversion, a wild ride that drew the militia away, giving Maria Luz and her family the chance to escape into the night. He had saved their lives. Her voice grew hard as she spoke of what came after. "He made a deal with a man, a surveyor for the railroad," she said, her hands clenching in her lap. "A man named Beckett. Your father guided his party through Kiowa territory, a safe passage, in exchange for a promise. Beckett swore on his honor that the railroad would not cross the sacred ground by the painted bluffs." Naya listened, her body rigid, every fear she had about her father's past crystallizing into a bitter truth. "Your father kept his word," Maria Luz continued, her eyes burning with an old anger. "He led them through safely, and when it was done, Silas Beckett put a price on his head. He told the army that Black Eagle was a renegade, that he had led the survey into an ambush that only Beckett's men had survived. It was all a lie. Beckett got his safe passage, and then he betrayed the man who gave it to him. He wanted the land, and he wanted your father out of the way." The story settled between them, heavy and suffocating. It was not a tale of a man who walked two roads, but of a man who had tried to forge a single path of peace and had been destroyed for it. Elias stared into the fire, the muscles in his jaw tight. He had been part of that machine, the one that ground up good men like Black Eagle. The shame he carried was no longer a dull ache. It was a fresh, open wound. The next day, they needed supplies, specifically ammunition and salt. The nearest place was a small settlement with a combined post and telegraph station. The moment Naya stepped inside, the atmosphere curdled. The air was thick with the smell of chewing tobacco and prejudice. The telegraph key chattered incessantly in the corner, a mechanical insect speaking in a language of clicks and dashes. The clerk, a thin man with a drooping mustache and pale, watery eyes, took one look at Naya and sneered. "We do not serve your kind in here," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Get out!" Naya stood her ground, her face impassive, but a cold fire ignited in her eyes. Around them, the other patrons, a collection of dusty cowboys and prospectors, watched with vacant curiosity, their faces showing no sign of protest. This was the natural order of things to them. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Naya and the clerk. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed a few coins on the counter. "A box of cartridges for a Colt and 2 pounds of salt," he said, his tone even. The clerk looked from Elias to Naya and back again. "She with you?" "We are traveling together," Elias said, leaving no room for argument. Grumbling, the clerk fetched the items, while he was weighing the salt. Elias moved toward the telegraph desk. He scribbled a quick message on a pad. It was a bluff, a desperate gamble to buy them time. The message was addressed to the commander of the army post at Fort Bascom. It reported a suspected case of smallpox at a cattle camp 20 miles south of their position, directly in the path of anyone coming from Palo Duro. He knew that the mere mention of the disease would snarl travel for days, creating roadblocks and quarantines. It was a lie, but a necessary one. He paid the operator, a bored young man who barely glanced at the message, and they left. They made camp that night by the river, the water whispering secrets to the stones. The confrontation at the station had left a bitter taste in Naya's mouth. It was a reminder of the world that had crushed her father, a world that saw her not as a person, but as something less. The gold, she thought, felt more and more like a curse. It was the reason Beckett had hunted her father, the reason McKendry was on their trail, the reason every step they took was fraught with the potential for violence. It promised salvation but seemed to bring only blood. Sleep would not come. She lay in her bedroll, staring at the indifferent stars, haunted by the image of her father, alone and betrayed. A nightmare finally claimed her. A chaotic swirl of shouting men, the crack of rifles, and the sight of her father falling. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom smell of gunpowder in her nostrils. She sat up, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Across from her, Elias was awake, sitting with his back against a rock, his rifle across his lap. He had been watching over her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the sheen of cold sweat on her brow. He rose without a word and came over to her. She flinched, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept under her sleeping roll. He stopped, seeing the movement. He did not offer empty platitudes or clumsy words of comfort. He understood that her fear was a wild thing that could not be soothed by a gentle hand. Instead, he did something else. He unbuckled the sheath from his own belt. In it was his Bowie knife, a heavy, well-balanced weapon with a blade that gleamed in the firelight. It was a part of him, an extension of his will, his primary tool for survival. He knelt and placed the sheathed knife on the ground beside her, within easy reach of her hand. The handle was turned toward her. He held her gaze for a long moment, his eyes conveying a message more profound than any words. It was a gesture of absolute trust. He was giving her his power, his defense. He was telling her that she had nothing to fear from him, that he was placing his own safety in her hands. Then he stood, turned, and walked back to his position by the dying fire, leaving the knife behind. Naya stared at the weapon. The leather of the sheath was worn smooth from use. The handle felt solid, real. It was a promise, offered in silence. In a world of betrayal and lies, it was the first piece of solid ground she had stood on in a very long time. She lay back down, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife, and for the first time that night, she felt the iron grip of fear begin to loosen. The landscape shifted as they rode deeper into the territory marked on the deerskin map. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills and then to the jagged teeth of canyons that bit into the earth. The air grew still, heavy with a sense of waiting. Naya felt it, a prickling on her skin that was older than memory. This was the land of her ancestors, a place that held both power and sorrow. She saw two ravens circling high overhead, their dark wings stark against the endless blue. They seemed to be watching, waiting to see what the humans below would do. A sign of choice. Her grandmother had always said, a choice between two paths. They found the valley in the late afternoon. It was a shallow, green basin, a secret place hidden from the harshness of the surrounding country. And in its center, just as the map had shown, stood two ancient cottonwood trees. They had grown together, their massive trunks leaning into one another. their highest branches intertwining to form a perfect, natural cross against the sky. The X on the map. Naya dismounted, her heart a heavy drum in her chest. For a moment, she could almost feel her father's presence beside her, a quiet strength in the dappled shade. This was the place. Elias remained on his horse, his eyes scanning the rim of the valley, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. He trusted Naya's knowledge, but he did not trust the silence. Silence in a place like this could be a trap. Naya approached the trees, her moccasins making no sound on the soft earth. She ran her hand over the rough bark, a silent communion with the past. She began to search the ground at the base of the twin trunks, her fingers probing the soil, pushing aside fallen leaves and loose stones. She was looking for a sign her father had told her about, a secret language between them. And then she found it. Almost completely hidden by grass and dirt were 3 small, rusted nails, driven deep into the hard-packed earth to form a triangle with a dot in the center. It was a silversmith's mark. Her father, in the years after he left the army, had learned the trade. It was a cover, a way to move through the world, to be seen as a craftsman and not a warrior. It was a way to hide in plain sight. "Here," she said, her voice tight with emotion. Elias dismounted and came to her side, bringing the shovel from his pack. He looked at the mark, then at Naya, seeing the fierce hope in her eyes. Together, they began to dig. The ground was hard, packed down by years of sun and wind. Sweat beaded on their foreheads, tracing clean paths through the dust on their skin. The work was slow, their breaths coming in ragged pants. For an hour they dug, the hole growing deeper. Naya's initial excitement began to curdle into a cold dread. What if it was gone? What if someone else had found it? Then, the shovel struck something with a dull, metallic thud. Their eyes met. A current of shared anticipation passed between them. They worked faster now, their hands scraping away the last of the dirt. It was an iron box, about 2 feet long, its surface pitted with rust. It was heavy, anchored to the earth by its own weight and the weight of the secrets it held. Using the shovel as a lever, Elias pried it from the ground. There was no lock, only a simple, heavy lid. He looked at Naya. It was her legacy to uncover. She knelt and, with a deep, steadying breath, lifted the lid. For a heartbeat, she stared, her mind refusing to understand what she was seeing. There was no gleam of gold, no stacks of coins, no heavy ingots. The box was filled not with treasure, but with paper. On top lay another map, this one drawn on drafting paper, far more detailed than the simple deerskin. Beneath it was a leather-bound ledger, a simple account book. Naya lifted it out, her hands trembling. This was not the salvation she had imagined. This was not the ransom that would buy back her people's land. She opened the book. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting. It was a mix of Comanche symbols and the English he had learned, the letters careful and deliberate. It was a journal, a record of his life, his hopes, his despair. Elias knelt beside her, a silent, supportive presence. Naya's eyes scanned the pages, and then she began to read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "They believe I seek this gold for myself," she read, translating the symbols and the simple English as she went. "They do not understand. Gold cannot be eaten. Gold cannot be drunk. It is the water that is the true treasure. Silas Beckett and his railroad. They do not just take the land, they take the wells, they take the springs, they choke the rivers. A people without water is a people already dead." Naya paused, her throat tight. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a dawning, world-altering understanding. She continued to read. "The gold I have gathered is not a treasure. It is a tool, a trust. With it, we can buy back the water rights. We can secure the wells at Agua Dulce and the headwaters of the Cimarron. We can file claims under their own laws, use their own paper to protect our lives. This is the only war we can win. Not a war of arrows and bullets, but a war of deeds and titles. The gold is not the end. It is the beginning." The words settled in the quiet air of the valley. The truth was so much bigger, so much heavier than Naya had ever imagined. Her father had not been a treasure hunter. He had been a strategist, a visionary. He was not trying to save his family. He was trying to save his entire nation. The weight of her personal quest, to clear his name and honor his memory, was suddenly transformed into the crushing responsibility for the survival of her people. The gold was not a prize to be won, but a duty to be fulfilled. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the sacred silence. The bullet ripped through the air where Naya's head had been a second before, thudding into the cottonwood tree behind her. Instinct took over. Elias tackled her, driving her down into the dirt behind the iron box as another shot splintered the air. McKendry, Elias yelled, drawing his Colt. The bounty hunter stepped out from a thicket of scrub oak on the other side of the clearing, a pistol in each hand, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Payday," he said, and fired again. The bullet ricocheted off the iron box with a high-pitched scream. Naya, her mind still reeling from her father's words, drew her own revolver. This was not a duel of honor. It was a close, ugly fight in the dirt. She and Elias used the excavated earth and the box for cover, firing back at McKendry, who used the trees. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunshots and the acrid smell of black powder. McKendry was a good shot, his bullets pinning them down, kicking up dirt just inches from their faces. Naya saw her chance. McKendry's horse was tethered nearby, a big roan, nervous and wild-eyed. Remembering her father's words, to choose the people, she made a decision. She took careful aim, not at the man, but at the animal. She squeezed the trigger. The horse screamed and went down, its front leg buckling. It was not a fatal shot, but the horse was crippled. McKendry was afoot. He roared in fury, turning his attention to his fallen mount. It was the opening they needed. But before they could act, a different sound echoed through the valley. It was a deep, booming report, a sound with more power, more finality. It came from the ridge overlooking the valley. Elias cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and was thrown back, his left shoulder erupting in a spray of red. Naya's head whipped around. She saw him then, a figure on the ridge, nearly 300 yards away, a man with a long rifle, its barrel resting on a rock. A Sharps rifle, a buffalo gun. Even at this distance, she recognized the confident, commanding posture of Silas Beckett. He was not a man who dirtied his own hands in a close fight. He was a man who killed from a distance, with the cold, impersonal power of technology. McKendry was just the dog. Beckett was the master. Elias Naya scrambled to his side. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his shoulder, a deep, bleeding furrow. He was conscious, his face pale and twisted in pain, but he was alive. "We have to go," he gritted out, trying to push himself up. "The canyon, behind the trees." Another shot from the Sharps kicked up a geyser of dirt beside them. Beckett was reloading. Taking his time, he knew he had them trapped. Naya grabbed the journal and the new map, stuffing them inside her shirt. She could not leave them. She helped Elias to his feet, his arm slung over her shoulder, his weight a heavy, dragging burden. They staggered toward a narrow cleft in the rock face behind the cottonwood trees, a dark slash in the stone that promised escape. McKendry, seeing them flee, started running toward them, firing as he came. Naya turned and fired back, not aiming to hit him, but to keep his head down, to buy them precious seconds. They reached the mouth of the narrow canyon and plunged into its shadows. It was barely wide enough for them to pass single file. "He will follow," Elias gasped, his breathing shallow. "I know," Naya said, her mind racing. She looked around. The canyon floor was littered with dry mesquite bushes. An idea, born of desperation and the old ways, took hold. She gathered a great armful of the dry, brittle leaves and branches. Using a flint and steel from her pouch, she struck a spark. The leaves caught instantly, erupting in a cloud of thick, pungent smoke. The wind was blowing out of the canyon, carrying the smoke back toward the valley floor. In seconds, a dense, choking screen obscured the entrance. They pushed deeper into the canyon. Elias was fading, leaving a trail of blood on the rocks. She could hear McKendry coughing and cursing behind them in the smoke. He would come through it eventually. "A trap," Elias managed to say, leaning heavily against the rock wall. "Rope, a tripwire." Naya understood immediately. She took the lariat from her saddle, which she had left tied on Elias's horse, working quickly, under his pained instruction. She stretched the rope taut across the narrowest part of the canyon, about a foot off the ground, tying it securely to two sturdy rock outcroppings. She disguised it with dust and loose pebbles. It was a simple cavalryman's trick, but in the dim light and the lingering smoke, it would be deadly. They scrambled further up the canyon and collapsed behind a large boulder, Naya's revolver in her hand, her ears straining. They heard him coming, his footsteps clumsy and angry. He burst through the last wisps of smoke, his eyes red and streaming. He did not see the rope. His boot caught, and he went down hard with a cry of surprise and pain, his head striking the rock floor with a sickening crack. He lay still. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the distant cry of the ravens. They were safe, for now. But Elias was wounded, and Silas Beckett was still out there, a patient predator with a long rifle, waiting on the ridge. The iron box and its promise of life for her people felt impossibly heavy, a burden that would now have to be carried through a valley of death. The journey to Calabash was a walking nightmare. Elias faded in and out of consciousness, a dead weight that Naya had to half drag, half carry. She tore strips from her own shirt to pack his wound, a bloody tear in the fabric of his shoulder that seemed to mock her efforts to keep him alive. They moved at a crawl, hiding by day and traveling by the cold light of the stars, living on jerky and a dwindling supply of water. The horses, sensing the desperation of their riders, were skittish and hard to manage. Every shadow was a threat, every gust of wind the sound of an approaching enemy. Naya's grief and the staggering weight of her new responsibility were burned away by the singular, immediate need to keep Elias breathing. Calabash was not so much a town as a raw wound on the landscape, a place of frantic, disordered growth, new lumber, pale against the old, weathered gray of the original buildings, was everywhere. Survey stakes bearing the initials of the Rio Grande and Western Railroad were driven into the ground along the main street, charting a course for the future that would obliterate the present. The air was thick with dust and the metallic clang of hammers, the sound of a place selling its soul for a promise. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a newly spun web, was Silas Beckett. They saw the posters nailed to every post and door. A town meeting. Beckett was going to address the citizens, to speak of prosperity, of jobs, of the bright future the railroad would bring. Naya got Elias into a livery stable, paying the last of her coins to a boy who looked at Elias's bloody shoulder with wide, frightened eyes. She found a room in a boarding house run by a weary woman who asked no questions, and she cleaned his wound as best she could with whiskey and a clean rag. He was feverish, his words a jumbled mix of old battles and forgotten names, leaving him to the mercy of his fever dreams. Naya slipped out into the town. She moved like a ghost, keeping to the alleys, her senses taking in the mood of the place. It was a town on the edge of a decision, a town hypnotized by the song of progress. She saw Maria Luz arguing with a group of farmers, her voice impassioned, her hands gesturing with a fierce energy. She had come ahead of them, a lone Cassandra trying to warn a town that did not want to be warned. The meeting was held in the open, in the dusty plaza in front of the half-finished shell of a new hotel. Silas Beckett stood on a platform made of new planks, a handsome, commanding figure in a fine Eastern suit that seemed immune to the dust. Beside him stood Sheriff Harlan, a man with a silver star on his chest and a weak chin, his eyes constantly shifting to Beckett for approval. Beckett spoke with a smooth, practiced charm. He painted a picture of a new era, of grain elevators and cattle cars, of jobs for every man and a school for every child. All they had to do was embrace the future. All they had to do was sign over the deeds to their wells and springs. A minor formality to ensure the railroad had the water it needed to run the great steam engines of progress. He called it a utility partnership. "This land has a great thirst," Beckett declared, his voice ringing with false sincerity. "And I am the man who can bring the water of prosperity to quench it." The crowd was divided. The farmers, their face etched with the worry of drought, looked tempted. The merchants and saloon keepers, smelling new money, were already convinced. Only a few. The older ranchers and a group of German and Czech miners standing off to one side looked skeptical, their arms crossed, their faces grim. Just as Sheriff Harlan stepped forward to endorse the plan, holding a stack of pre-written deeds, Naya moved. She walked out of the shadow of the blacksmith shop and into the center of the plaza. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to her, a Comanche woman, alone, her face set like stone, on the platform. Beckett's smile tightened. He had not expected this. Naya held up the leather-bound journal. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried in the sudden silence, clear and steady. Her English was halting, the words carefully chosen. "This is the book of my father, Black Eagle," she began. She opened it to a marked page. He knew a man who made promises, a man who spoke of partnership. She looked directly at Beckett. This man had my father guide him. He promised the railroad would not touch the sacred lands. My father kept his word. This man did not. She turned a page. This man, he makes you the same promise now. He asks for your water. He will give you paper. My father wrote it here. She held the book out. He wrote that this man had the elders sign a paper for protection. He said, but the paper was a deed. He did not protect them. He stole their wells. He stole their lives. A murmur went through the crowd. A farmer in the front shouted, "What would a savage know of deeds and laws?" But one of the German miners called out, "Let her speak. We have heard Beckett's words. Let us hear hers." Naya's story, supported by the simple, earnest words in her father's journal, began to sow seeds of doubt. The illusion of a shared prosperity began to crack. The people of Calabash were not fools. They had seen enough land grabs and slick promises to know the scent of a lie. Beckett saw he was losing them. He did not try to argue. He did not try to reason. He acted. He gave a small, sharp nod. Two men, who had been standing near the edge of the crowd, moved with brutal efficiency. They grabbed Maria loose. She cried out, struggling, but they were too strong. They dragged her toward the platform, a pistol pressed to her head. The crowd gasped. The debate was over. This was no longer about promises and paper. It was about power. "The girl is a liar and a thief," Beckett announced, his voice cold and hard. The charming mask gone. "She is in possession of a stolen iron box. It contains funds misappropriated from my railroad survey. I want it returned. You will bring it to me by sundown, or this woman will pay the price for your foolishness." As the town stood in stunned silence, a new sound cut through the tension, a cry of alarm, of pure terror, fire. Everyone turned. At the far end of town, a column of thick, black smoke was boiling into the sky. Flames, angry and orange, licked at the walls of Jedediah's grain storehouse, the largest in the settlement, holding the entire season's harvest for half a dozen local farmers. Panic erupted. The meeting dissolved as men ran for buckets, for horses, for their very livelihoods, which were now turning to ash. In the confusion, Naya saw McKendry, his face smudged with soot. Standing near the edge of the chaos, he pointed a finger directly at her. It was her, he screamed. "I saw her, the Comanche bitch set the fire." The tide of public opinion, which had been slowly turning in her favor, reversed in a violent, terrifying surge. The fear of a bad deal was replaced by the primal terror of fire and the old deep-seated hatred of the outsider. The faces that had been looking at her with curiosity and doubt now twisted with rage and accusation, as if the scene were not chaotic enough. A lone rider galloped into town, his horse lathered in sweat, his blue uniform coated in dust. He was a corporal from the army. He reined his horse to a skidding halt. "I am looking for the telegraph operator," he yelled. "We received a wire about a smallpox outbreak. It is a hoax. A dangerous and illegal lie. Federal troops are on their way to this town to find the man responsible and to quell this disturbance." His eyes scanned the crowd, finally landing on Elias, who had stumbled out of the boarding house. Drawn by the commotion, his face pale with fever, the corporal recognized the description he had been given. You are the one who sent the message." The world seemed to contract around Naya. It was a perfect trap. Her only witness was now a hostage. The town, which had almost listened, now believed she was a terrorist. And Elias, her only ally, had been exposed as a liar. His desperate attempt to help them now serving as the final nail in their coffin. His dirty trick had not bought them time. It had brought the army down upon their heads. She and Elias were pushed back by the angry mob, forced into the alley beside the boarding house. The heat from the burning granary washed over them. The shouts of the crowd. "Murderer, savage liar," echoed in the narrow space. Naya turned on him, her face a mask of cold fury and bitter betrayal. "You and your white man's tricks," she hissed, her voice low and shaking with rage. "You lie with wires just as Beckett lies with words. There is no difference. You have brought this on us. You have brought the army here to finish the job he started." Elias leaned against the wall, the fever in his wound and the weight of his failure crushing him. He had no defense. She was right. He had tried to fight fire with fire, and all he had done was burn down their only chance of escape. They were alone, surrounded by enemies, their credibility in ashes, and the full, unthinking weight of federal law was about to come crashing down upon them. They fled into the hills as the town of Calabash tore itself apart. The fire was their salvation, a terrible, roaring distraction that drew every eye, every ounce of rage and panic. In the chaos, no one noticed a Comanche woman and a wounded man slip away from the alley, melting into the long shadows cast by the flames. They moved through the darkness, Elias leaning on Naya, his breath coming in hot, shallow bursts. Every step was an agony. The shouts of the mob and the crackle of the burning grain faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the pinon pines. A cold rain began to fall, a slow, miserable drizzle that promised to turn into a downpour. It plastered their hair to their heads and turned the dusty ground to a slick, treacherous mud. They found shelter by pure chance, a small, abandoned lean-to on a high slope overlooking the distant, flickering wound of the town. It was a crude thing, a frame of old cedar poles covered in stiff, rotting buffalo hides, probably left by a long-forgotten hunter. But it was dry. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Naya eased Elias to the ground, his groan a low, ragged sound in the close space. She felt her way around, her hands discovering a small pile of dry wood and tinder left in a corner. With painstaking care, her fingers numb with cold, she struck a spark from her flint and steel. A tiny flame wavered, caught, and grew, pushing back the oppressive dark and filling the small shelter with a warm, dancing light. In the flickering glow, Elias's face was a pale, sweat-sheened mask of pain. His fever was high. The crude bandage on his shoulder was soaked through with a mixture of blood and rain. Naya knew that if the wound was not cleaned properly, the fever would consume him. She worked in silence, her earlier anger a banked coal beneath a layer of grim necessity. She heated water from her canteen in a small tin cup she carried, tore a fresh strip from the hem of her tunic, and gently began to peel away the soiled dressing. Elias winced. His teeth clenched, but he did not make a sound. The bullet had gouged a deep channel through the muscle, and the edges of the wound were red and swollen. To clean it properly, she had to get his torn shirt off. She eased the wet, sticky fabric from his good arm, and then, carefully, she began to work it over his wounded shoulder and his back. As she pulled the cloth away, the firelight washed over his skin, and she saw them. She went utterly still. Her breath caught in her throat. His back was a landscape of old pain, thick, ropey scars, long since healed over but still pale and angry against his tanned skin. Crisscrossed his back from his shoulders to his waist. They were not the clean lines of a knife or the ragged tear of a bullet. They were the marks of a whip, laid on with a brutal, methodical cruelty. For a long moment, she could not move. The rage she had felt in the alley, her bitter words about his lies and his white man's tricks, turned to ash in her mouth. These were not the scars of a conqueror. They were the scars of the punished, the broken. Her hand, of its own accord, reached out. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, traced the path of one of the thickest scars. Elias flinched, a violent, involuntary shudder that had nothing to do with the pain in his shoulder. It was the memory of the lash, a ghost that still lived in his skin. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice husky. He did not answer at first, his head bowed. The rain drummed a soft, steady rhythm on the hide roof, a lonely sound that seemed to amplify the silence between them. "Army justice," he finally said, his voice a low rasp. "I was a sergeant. A long time ago, we were escorting a group of peaceful Arapaho to a reservation. My commanding officer, he was a man who enjoyed his authority. He decided they were not moving fast enough. He began to use his riding crop on the women and the old men. He took a ragged breath. I told him to stop. He told me to mind my rank. I took the crop from him. I broke it over my knee. They held a field court-martial that night. Insubordination. Striking a superior officer. They gave me 50 lashes and a dishonorable discharge. They left me in the desert to die." Naya stared at the scars, and she saw it all. The arrogant officer, the defenseless people, the single act of defiance that had cost him everything. The shame he carried was not just for his part in the railroad survey. It was for this, for a system that punished a man for an act of basic human decency. Her anger at him, so hot and righteous just hours before, felt small and foolish now. She understood. She finally understood the deep, abiding source of his need to make things right. She said nothing. She simply took the clean, wet cloth and began to gently clean the bullet wound, her touch now infinitely tender. When she was done, she packed it with the last of the healing herbs she carried and bound it tightly with the fresh dressing. He sat motionless, allowing her to tend to him, a silent truce passing between them in the small, firelit space. The rain fell harder, a steady, cleansing downpour that washed the dust from the air and the blood from the ground. They sat for a long time, listening to the storm, two fugitives huddled together against a world that wanted them dead. Elias finally broke the silence. He looked at her, his eyes clear of the fever for the first time, though they were filled with a deep, soul-weary sadness. His gaze was direct, unwavering. He leaned a little closer, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him over the rain. "Come with me," he said. The words hung in the air. Naya's heart clenched. It was the one thing she feared most, the invitation to run, to abandon her father's quest, to give up on her people, to become just another lost soul drifting through the territory with a man who was as broken as she was. The fear of being possessed, of losing her own will to another's, rose up in her, cold and sharp. She pulled back slightly, her expression hardening. "Run where? Elias, there is no place for us to go. Your army is coming. Beckett holds the town. He holds our friend. My father's journal is just paper now. We have lost—" "No," he said, his voice gaining a new strength, a fierce conviction. "That is not what I mean. I do not mean run away. I mean see this through. With me." He leaned forward again, his intensity a physical force. "Come with me. We will get Maria Luce back. We will find a way to get that journal in front of the right people, not the mob, not the army, the miners, The farmers who have been cheated. We will use Beckett's own greed against him. We will finish what your father started. Together." She stared at him, at the raw hope burning in his eyes. He was not asking her to follow him. He was asking her to stand with him. He was not trying to take over her quest. He was offering to shoulder its weight alongside her. He was not taking her will. He was affirming it. The fear that had lived in her heart for so long, the fear of being consumed, finally broke and washed away, carried off by the sound of the cleansing rain. In that moment, he was not a white man. She was not a Comanche. They were simply two people, bound by a shared purpose, a shared enemy, and a shared, unspoken understanding of the scars, both visible and hidden, that they carried. Slowly, hesitantly, she moved closer. She looked at his mouth, then back to his eyes. He did not move. He waited. It was her choice. She leaned in and touched her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was brief, gentle, almost shy. It tasted of rain and wood smoke and a trust that had been earned through blood and fire. When they parted, there were no words. There was no need for them. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His hand was warm and strong. Her hand, in his, felt steady. It felt right. "If I fall," she said, her voice a low vow in the quiet shelter, "you will take the journal. You will see that the water is protected, for the people." "And if I fall," he answered, his voice equally solemn, his grip tightening on her hand, "you will do the same. This is bigger than us now." They sealed their pact, not with another kiss, but with that simple, powerful clasp of hands. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the small, fragile shelter, a quiet strength had been forged, a partnership born of shared wounds and a renewed, unbreakable promise. They would not run. They would turn and face the storm together. The rain washed the world clean, leaving behind the sharp scent of wet earth and pine. Elias's fever broke with the dawn, replaced by a clean, sharp pain in his shoulder and a weary clarity in his eyes. They had a plan, forged in the firelit dark of the hunter's lean-to, a desperate strategy with a dozen ways to fail. It began with finding allies in a town that had branded them as enemies. Naya moved under the cover of the pre-dawn gray, a shadow among shadows. She avoided the main streets of Calabash, skirting the town and approaching from the west, where a rough camp of tents and lean-tos housed the miners Beckett was systematically squeezing. She found them huddled around a breakfast fire, their face hard and grim, speaking in a low mix of German and Czech. They were men who knew the language of rock and earth, and they recognized the false gleam of Beckett's promises. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man named Anton, his hands as big and calloused as stone hammers. He was suspicious when Naya approached, his hand never straying far from the pickaxe handle that leaned against a crate. The other miners went silent, their eyes wary. Naya did not waste time with pleasantries. She told them of her father's journal, of Beckett's documented history of theft and betrayal. "He promises you jobs," she said, her voice low and direct. "He will pay you in scrip for his own store and charge you rent for the land you work. When you are in his debt, he will own you. This is his way." Anton grunted. "We know this. But what can be done, Harlan is his man. The law is what Beckett says it is." "The law is paper," Naya countered, pulling the journal from inside her tunic. "This is paper too, but it holds the truth. If the people of this town, the real people, not the drifters and the grifters, hear this truth in a place they respect, they will listen." She proposed the plan. They would gather in the town's small, unpainted church that evening. She would read from the journal, but for the words to have power, they needed a witness who was known and trusted. They needed Maria Luz. Anton considered this, his shrewd eyes studying Naya's face. He saw no deceit there, only a fierce, unwavering purpose. He looked at his fellow miners, saw their grim nods of agreement. They were trapped men, and she was offering them a key. "We will be there, Anton said. But you must bring the woman. Without her, it is just your word against his. The two halves of the plan were set in motion. Elias, though weak, was determined to play his part. He found an old, discarded horseshoe in the livery scrap pile, with a file borrowed from a sympathetic blacksmith who hated Beckett for cornering the market on iron. He painstakingly altered it, creating a small, distinctive chip on the outer edge, a perfect replica of the mark left by McKendry's horse. He rode out of town, not south toward the army post, but east, into a labyrinth of badlands, a maze of steep-walled arroyos and canyons. He worked with the focused precision of a master scout, laying a false trail. He dismounted, using a stick to press the altered shoe into the dirt at careful intervals, creating the tracks of a single horse, moving quickly. He scuffed the ground to show haste, broke a branch here and there. It was a story told in signs, a story of a lone rider fleeing in panic, a story designed to appeal to a predator's instincts. The trail led directly toward the narrow, inescapable mouth of Box Canyon. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Naya began her own hunt. She had watched Beckett's men move Maria loose from the makeshift jail in the sheriff's office to a large warehouse at the edge of town, near the stacks of new railroad ties. It was a smarter place to keep a prisoner, easier to guard, with fewer witnesses. Naya circled the building, studying it from every angle. There were 2 guards at the front door, lazy and bored in the afternoon heat. A single window, high up, was boarded over. The back of the warehouse faced a chaotic yard filled with mountains of wooden railroad ties, steel rails, and barrels of creosote. It was a construction site, a place of organized chaos, and chaos was what she needed. She waited. Patience was a weapon her people had perfected over generations. Finally, in the late afternoon, a wagon arrived to unload supplies. The 2 guards, eager for a distraction, went to help the driver. Their attention focused on the heavy crates. It was the opening she'd been waiting for. She slipped around the side of the building, a flicker of movement in the long shadows. A rear loading door was barred from the inside, but a small ventilation hatch near the roof was unsecured. Using a stack of discarded lumber as a ladder, she climbed, pulled herself up, and squeezed through the narrow opening, dropping silently into the dusty gloom inside. The warehouse was vast, a cavern filled with the smell of cut pine and machine oil. Crates were stacked high, creating narrow aisles and deep shadows. In the center of the space, tied to a support pillar, was Maria Luce. She was gagged, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. A single guard sat on a crate nearby, cleaning his rifle, his back to Naya. Naya moved like a cat, her moccasins making no sound on the dirt floor. She picked up a heavy iron wrench from a workbench. She was 10 feet from the guard when a floorboard creaked behind her. She froze. The guard heard it too and started to turn. But before he could, a new voice cut through the silence. Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Sheriff Harlan stood in the doorway, his pistol drawn, a smug, triumphant look on his weak face. He had seen her climb the lumber. He had waited, letting her trap herself. The guard scrambled to his feet, leveling his rifle. Naya was caught between them. Harlan gestured with his pistol. "Drop the wrench, girl. It is over." Naya let the wrench fall with a heavy thud. It was not over. She would never let it be over. As Harlan stepped forward, savoring his victory, Naya kicked a small, empty barrel into his path. He stumbled, cursing, his shot going wide and burying itself in a wooden beam overhead. In that instant, Naya ran, not for the door, but deeper into the warehouse, toward the back lot. She burst through the rear loading doors, which were unbarred, and into the blinding sunlight and the maze of railroad ties. Harlan was right behind her, his boots clumsy on the uneven ground. "You are not getting away," he yelled, firing again. A splinter of wood flew from a tie near her head. The yard was an obstacle course. She vaulted over low stacks, squeezed between tall ones, her movements fluid and sure. Harlan was slower, his bulk working against him, his rage making him reckless. He was a man of the town, of flat streets and wooden sidewalks. This was her world, a world of uneven terrain and tactical movement. She came to a wide, open space where new rails were laid out, waiting to be spiked. She had nowhere else to go. She turned to face him. He came to a halt 20 yards away, breathing heavily, raising his pistol for a clear shot. But Naya was already moving. In her hand was her lariat, the coiled rope a familiar weight. She had pulled it from her belt as she ran. Before Harlan could steady his aim, her wrist flicked. The rope sailed through the air. A perfect, open loop. It settled over his head and shoulders, and she pulled it taut, pinning his arms to his sides. He gave a cry of shock, his pistol firing harmlessly into the sky. Naya did not stop. She planted her feet and pulled, using his own forward momentum against him. He crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. She was on him in an instant, her knife at his throat. He lay gasping, his face a mask of terror, the smugness gone, replaced by the certainty of his own death. But she did not kill him. She took his pistol, his gun belt, and his own rope from his saddle, which was tied nearby. With quick, efficient knots, she trussed him up like a calf for branding, tying him securely to a tall stack of ties in the middle of the yard. In plain sight of the town, she left him there, disarmed and humiliated, a symbol of the law, bound and helpless for all to see. She ran back to the warehouse. The remaining guard, having seen his sheriff's defeat, had fled. Naya cut Maria loose free. They escaped together, slipping out of the back of the yard and circling around toward the church, where the miners were already beginning to gather in the evening shadows. The first part of their plan had worked, but miles away, in the deepening twilight of Box Canyon, McKendry was stirring. He had not been killed by the fall, only stunned. He pushed himself to his feet, his head throbbing, his face a bloody mask. He saw the empty canyon, the clever, false trail. He had been tricked. He had been made a fool of. A cold, murderous rage burned away the pain. The canyon walls were steep, but not impossible. He found a series of handholds, a narrow chimney in the rock. With a grunt of effort, he began to climb. He rode into Beckett's camp just after full dark. He found the railroad baron in his private rail car, studying maps under the glow of an oil lamp. "They got away," McKendry growled, dispensing with any formality. "The woman and Quinn, they took the Kiowa woman, and they have the book." Beckett did not look up from his map. He simply took a slow sip of his whiskey. And Sheriff Harlan, tied up like a Christmas goose in his own rail yard, McKendry spat. Beckett finally looked up, a thin, cold smile on his lips. He showed no sign of anger or surprise. "It does not matter. Our problem will be solved tomorrow night. The 8 o'clock supply train from Santa Fe will be carrying more than hardtack and ammunition. It will be carrying a platoon of federal soldiers and a United States Marshal with a warrant. By the time they arrive, the good people of Calabash will be so terrified of a Comanche uprising that they will welcome the army as saviors. The soldiers will restore order. My order." He stood up and looked out the window at the dark, silent plains. Let them have their little meeting in their little church. Let them read from their little book. By this time tomorrow, the only law in this valley will be the one that comes out of the barrel of a government rifle. The intelligence came from one of Anton's miners, a young man who had seen the telegraph message himself before the operator. A Beckett man had locked the office. A military train was coming. The lie Elias had told had been untangled, and the truth, in the form of federal troops, was now racing toward them along iron rails. They had one night. They worked in the dark, with only a sliver of moon to guide them. The wooden railroad bridge that spanned the deep, dry chasm of Arroyo Seco was a skeletal silhouette against the stars. It was their only choke point, the only place where the implacable power of the locomotive could be brought to a halt. The wind moaned through the trestles, a mournful sound, like a warning. Elias, his shoulder tightly bound, moved with a pained stiffness. He directed the work with the quiet authority of a man who understood the physics of stress and leverage. "Not there," he whispered, his voice a low rasp in the darkness. "We need to brace the joint where the main support meets the crossbeam. We are not trying to break it. We are trying to make it seize." Destruction would have been easier. A single charge of dynamite, a few cut support beams, and the bridge would have collapsed, taking the train with it. But that was not their way. To do so would be to murder the soldiers on board, men who were only following orders, and to prove Beckett's accusations correct. They were not saboteurs. They were defenders. They were trying to stop a crime, not commit one. Naya was agile and sure-footed in the dark, moving across the narrow beams as if she were born to them. She and the miners, Anton among them, carried heavy wedge-shaped blocks of oak they had cut from a fallen tree. Following Elias's direction, they hammered the wedges into the critical joints of the bridge's support structure. The blows of the mallets were muffled, each man striking with a careful, controlled force. The dull thuds swallowed by the vast, empty night. It was precise, demanding work. If the wedges were too loose, they would fail. If they were too tight, the strain might snap the timbers prematurely. They were building a lock, not a bomb. The wedges would allow the bridge to bear the weight of the slow-moving train. But when the great engine tried to cross at speed, the added vibration and torque would cause the joints to bind, to groan, to threaten collapse. The engineer, feeling the shudder, the unnatural resistance, would be forced to stop. It was a delicate, dangerous gamble. As she worked, Naya thought of her father. She remembered his hands, how they could be strong enough to draw a bow and gentle enough to carve a child's toy. He had been a builder, a man who tried to connect two worlds. Beckett was a destroyer, a man who broke whatever stood in his way. Tonight, she and Elias were not destroying. They were interrupting. They were forcing a pause, creating a moment where the truth might have a chance to be heard. They finished their work as the first pale light began to stain the eastern sky. The wedges were nearly invisible, silent wooden guardians waiting for the arrival of the iron beast. The sun rose on a town simmering with tension. The impromptu hearing took place on the wide, covered porch of the church, the only place seen as neutral ground. It was not a court of law, but a court of public opinion. Anton and his miners stood on one side, a silent, formidable wall of muscle and discontent. The farmers and ranchers, their faces etched with worry, gathered in the dusty street before the porch. Naya and Elias stood near the doors, Elias's face pale but his eyes resolute. Maria Luz was the first to speak. She stood tall and straight, her voice clear and unwavering, though her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. She did not speak of laws or contracts. She spoke of trust. She told the story of how Silas Beckett had come to her people, speaking of friendship, how he had shared their food and admired their children. She described how he had presented a document, written in a language they could not read, and called it a paper of peace and protection. "He did not protect us," she said, her dark eyes sweeping across the faces of the farmers. "He stole our water. The spring that had fed our people for 1,000 seasons ran dry. When our crops failed, when our animals began to die of thirst, he offered to buy our land for pennies. He did not buy land. He bought our despair." Her testimony was simple, personal, and devastatingly effective. The farmers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the predatory pattern, seeing their own possible future in her past. Anton spoke next. He was not eloquent, but his anger was a palpable force. He held up a crumpled piece of paper. "This is a receipt," he boomed, his voice echoing in the quiet street. "A receipt for a poll tax, a tax Silas Beckett invented, to be paid to his company, for the privilege of working a claim that is not on his land. He is taxing us for the dirt we dig, for the sweat on our backs. He is a thief in a fine suit." The mood of the crowd, which had been hostile and suspicious, was beginning to turn. They were listening. They were seeing the connections between the fire, the railroad, and the slow strangulation of their own livelihoods. Then, Silas Beckett arrived. He was not alone. McKendry walked beside him, his hand never far from his gun, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's coldness. Beckett did not look angry. He looked amused. He strode onto the porch as if he owned it, a patient smile on his handsome face. He listened to the last of Anton's accusations. Then he chuckled, a sound of pure, condescending dismissal. "These are serious and, frankly, ridiculous allegations," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "Allegations from a known arsonist and a group of disgruntled laborers. Fortunately, we do not have to rely on the word of such people." He produced a folded document from the inside of his coat. It was heavy parchment, bearing a thick red wax seal. He held it up for all to see. The seal was that of the United States Territorial Authority. It was a symbol of absolute power, of a government far away that held their lives in its hands. "This is a federal injunction," Beckett announced, his voice ringing with authority. "It recognizes the Rio Grande and Western Railroad's primary claim to all water and mineral rights in this valley. Pending the completion of the line, it further identifies this woman, Naya, as a hostile agent and authorizes her immediate arrest. Any person interfering with the lawful business of the railroad or offering aid to this fugitive will be subject to federal prosecution." The document was a lie, a masterfully crafted forgery, but the seal was real, obtained through bribery and corruption. To the people of Calabash, it was an unanswerable edict. You could argue with a man. You could not argue with a federal seal. The hope that had begun to blossom on the church porch withered and died in an instant. As the crowd stood in stunned, defeated silence, a single sharp rifle shot cracked the morning air. It came from a rooftop across the street. One of Anton's miners, a young man standing at the edge of the porch, cried out and collapsed, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. Panic erupted. Women screamed. Men dove for cover. The fragile assembly dissolved into a terrified mob. It was McKendry's work. A single, brutal act of terror designed to shatter their will, to prove that Beckett's law was the only one that mattered. Naya and Elias were left standing on the porch, the wounded miner groaning at their feet, the forged document lying on the wooden planks like a dead snake. Their plan had failed. They had brought truth, and Beckett had answered with a lie. They had brought people together, and he had answered with a bullet. In the chaos, they heard one of Beckett's men shouting to another, "Get the wagons. We are moving the gold to the siding now. It will be loaded onto the military train tonight." Naya looked at the fallen miner, at the terrified faces of the townspeople scattering like quail. She looked at Elias, whose face was a grim mask of fury and despair. There was no one left to appeal to. The law was a weapon in their enemy's hand. The community was paralyzed by fear. They had no recourse, no path left, except one. She remembered her father's last words, the true meaning of which was now searingly clear. If you have to choose between the gold and the people, choose the people. The gold was never the prize. It was a tool, and the people were bleeding. Choosing them now meant something different. It meant fighting. It meant stopping Beckett, not with words on a porch, but with direct, physical force. They had tried to walk the path of peace. Beckett had just burned that bridge behind them. All that was left was the final, desperate confrontation. The time for words was over. As the terrified citizens of Calabash scattered, Silas Beckett's men moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of wolves. They were not loading supplies. They were loading a single, heavy, iron-bound chest onto a reinforced wagon, the gold, not of Black Eagle, but the accumulated wealth Beckett had bled from the miners and ranchers. It was the plunder he intended to secure, the final piece of his conquest. McKendry, his face a mask of cold fury, mounted his new horse, a powerful gray, and took his place as the convoy's guard. His rifle rested easy in the crook of his arm. This was not a retreat. It was a tactical withdrawal. From the mouth of an alley, Naya and Elias watched. Elias leaned against the wall, his face pale, a hand pressed to his wounded shoulder, but his eyes were clear, burning with a cold fire that matched her own. There was only one route from the town to the temporary rail siding where the military train would stop. It was a winding, treacherous track that cut through a narrow, rocky pass known to Naya's people as Thorn Canyon. "The wind in that place," Naya said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "It does not behave. It blows back on itself. It can be used." A plan, desperate and lethal, formed between them in the charged silence. A strategy woven from her intimate knowledge of the land and his grim understanding of ambush and diversion. There was no other way. To let that wagon reach the train was to let Beckett win. To let the truth be buried forever under the weight of federal steel. Thorn Canyon was a claustrophobic slash in the earth, its walls too steep to climb, its floor a jumble of rock and thorny scrub. By late afternoon, it was a trap, bathed in shadow and silence. Naya had worked with a frantic, focused energy, her hands scraping fine, pale dust from a limestone outcrop she had known since childhood. She spread the powder in a thin, almost invisible layer across a 50-foot stretch of the trail. Above, on a narrow ledge overlooking the powdered ground, Elias took his position. His shoulder was a constant, searing pain, but his hands were steady as he held the small signal mirror. Further down the canyon, just around a sharp bend, Naya had used her knife and hands to deepen a natural sand pit, covering the soft, yielding trap with a fragile lattice of dead branches and leaves. They did not have to wait long. They heard the rumble of the wagon wheels, the clink of harness, the low curses of the driver. McKendry rode point, his eyes sweeping the canyon rims, his senses on high alert. Beckett, ever the commander, rode beside the wagon, his fine suit now covered in a layer of trail dust. The horses entered the powdered section of the trail. At first, nothing happened. Then, the canyon's strange, contrary wind swirled. It did not blow the dust forward, but lifted it, creating a sudden choking cloud of white. The led horses screamed, rearing in blind panic, their eyes and lungs filled with the sharp, abrasive powder. The driver fought with the reins, his shouts lost in the confusion. At that exact moment, a blinding star bloomed on the canyon wall. Elias had caught the sun. He angled the mirror, painting a searing flash of light directly into McKendry's face. The bounty hunter cried out, throwing up a hand to shield his eyes, his rifle firing wildly, the shot ricocheting off the rocks with a high, angry whine. Chaos erupted. The horses, already panicked by the dust, were now fighting the bit, threatening to tear the wagon apart. In that perfect moment of distraction, a rope snaked out from behind a boulder. Naya did not aim for a man. She aimed for the machine, the lariat's loop, thrown with a lifetime of practice, settled perfectly over the hub and axle of the wagon's front wheel. She did not pull. She braced, wrapping the other end of the rope around a rock outcropping, her body taking the strain. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The spinning wheel locked. The wagon, pulled forward by the terrified horses, lurched violently to one side. There was a sound like a pistol shot as the thick oak axle snapped. The entire wagon tipped, its great weight carrying it over the edge of the trail, and it crashed down into the concealed sand pit. It landed on its side with a great, splintering groan, the iron chest breaking free and burying itself half deep in the soft, yielding sand. McKendry, his vision clearing, saw Elias on the ledge above. With a roar of pure, murderous rage, he spurred his horse, intending to charge, but Elias was already sliding down the scree slope, a knife in his hand. He met McKendry not as a sniper, but as a man on the ground. The fight was short, brutal, and ugly. It was not a duel of skill, but a desperate, grunting brawl in the dirt. McKendry had reach, but Elias had a low center of gravity and a cold, calculating fury. A knife flashed, opening a shallow cut on Elias's arm. Elias ignored it, driving his shoulder into McKendry's chest, taking him to the ground. They rolled in the dust, Two animals locked in a struggle for dominance. Elias, using his weight and the last of his strength, got the upper hand. He pressed the point of his Bowie knife to the soft flesh under McKendry's jaw. The bounty hunter went still, his eyes wide with the sudden, intimate knowledge of his own death. Elias's breath was a ragged saw in his chest. He could feel the man's pulse beating against his blade. He could end it. He could silence the man who had hunted them, who had murdered the miner. But he saw Naya's face in his mind, heard her father's words. "Choose the people. You are going to live," Elias rasped, his voice a low growl of command. "And you are going to talk." McKendry's eyes widened in disbelief, and then, seeing the absolute certainty in Elias's face, he gave a short, terrified nod. Survival was the only creed he truly held. Across the crash site, Silas Beckett climbed out from the wreckage. His suit was torn, his face bleeding from a long scratch, but his arrogance was untouched. He saw Naya standing by the half-buried chest, her revolver held steady in her hand, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She was the cause of all of it. The girl, the book, the defiance. He pulled a small, silver-plated derringer from his vest pocket, a gentleman's weapon for a back-alley murder. He raised the pistol and aimed it at her heart. "You have cost me everything." "You savage witch!" he hissed. He fired, but Elias had seen the movement. With a desperate shout, he threw himself in front of Naya. He was not fast enough to stop the bullet, but he was fast enough to change its path. The small-caliber slug, meant for her heart, tore through his side, a hot, searing line of fire along his ribs. He grunted in pain and stumbled, but he did not fall. Naya did not have time to think. Her own revolver was already up, her aim a cold, steady extension of her will. She did not aim for his chest. She did not aim for his head. She aimed for the hand that held the weapon. She fired once. The heavy slug from her Colt smashed into Beckett's right hand with devastating force. Bone shattered. The derringer flew from his nerveless fingers. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and shock, staggering back and clutching the mangled, bloody ruin of his hand. The canyon fell silent, the echoes of the gunshots fading, leaving only the sound of Beckett's pained whimpers and the ragged breathing of the fighters. Then they heard a new sound, the jingle of spurs, the steady, disciplined tread of boots on rock. A dozen blue-coated soldiers appeared at the mouth of the canyon, their rifles at the ready. At their head was a man with a grim face and a silver star pinned to his vest, a United States Marshal. He took in the scene of carnage in a single, sweeping glance: the wrecked wagon, the wounded men, Beckett cradling his shattered hand, McKendry held at knife point. His eyes finally settled on Naya, her pistol still smoking. "Drop the weapon," the marshal commanded, his voice like stones grinding together. "You are under arrest by the authority of the United States government." But before Naya could respond, a crowd of people appeared behind the soldiers. It was Anton and the miners, their faces grim, their hands holding not guns, but shovels and pickaxes, the tools of their trade. With them was Maria Luz, and being dragged between two burly miners was the humiliated, terrified figure of Sheriff Harlan. Marshal Anton's voice boomed. "That warrant you hold is a lie, bought and paid for by that man." He pointed a thick, accusing finger at Beckett. "He is the criminal here. He murdered a member of my crew this morning in cold blood." Maria Luz stepped forward. "He is a thief," she declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "He stole my people's land. He lied to them. This woman," she said, gesturing to Naya, "speaks the truth." The marshal looked from the official document in his hand to the growing crowd of angry, determined faces. He was a man of the law, and the law was clear. But the evidence before him was a chaotic, undeniable mess. "And you," the marshal said, his eyes fixing on the captured Sheriff Harlan. "You are the law in this town. What do you have to say?" Harlan, his face pale with sweat, looked at Beckett's bleeding hand, at the cold fury of the miners, and at the federal star on the marshal's chest. His loyalty, always a commodity for sale. Found a new buyer. It is true, he stammered. All of it. Beckett paid me. He paid me to look the other way, to enforce his claims. He planned all of it. The marshal's face was a stone mask. It was a local sheriff's word against a powerful man's. It was still not enough. Then Elias shoved McKendry forward, the knife still at his throat. The bounty hunter stumbled into the clearing. Ask him, Elias gritted out. Ask him who paid him to set the fire. Ask him who paid him to shoot a man in the back this morning. All eyes turned to McKendry. He looked at Beckett, who could offer him no protection now. He looked at the marshal, at the soldiers, at the angry miners. He saw no escape, only a choice between a quick death and a long prison sentence. He chose life. It was Beckett, McKendry said, his voice a hoarse croak. He hired me. He told me to burn the granary, to blame the girl. He told me to shoot the miner, to scare the crowd. It was all him, all of it. The final piece fell into place. The testimony of the community, the confession of the hired gun, the cowardice of the corrupt lawman. It was an avalanche of truth that buried Beckett's forged document and his stolen authority. The marshal looked at Silas Beckett, no longer seeing a titan of industry, but a common, bleeding criminal. The real law, messy and complicated and undeniable, had finally arrived in Thorn Canyon. The dust settled in Thorn Canyon, not just on the rocks and the wrecked wagon, but on an entire chapter of fear and corruption. The marshal, a man whose rigid adherence to the law was tempered by a deeper sense of justice, did not hesitate. Silas Beckett, his hand crudely bandaged and his arrogance finally shattered, was placed in irons. Sheriff Harlan, stripped of his star, was bound with his own rope. McKendry, seeing the tide had turned completely, offered no resistance, his confession earning him nothing more than a place in the line of prisoners destined for the territorial court. The arrival of the federal troops was no longer a threat, but a necessity, their presence now serving to enforce a just outcome rather than a fraudulent one. In the days that followed, the storm that had broken over Calabash gave way to a slow, steady rebuilding, not just of the burned granary, but of the town's very soul. The iron chest, filled with Beckett's stolen gold, was impounded by the marshal, but Naya's father's journal, its pages filled with his careful script and visionary plans, became a legal document of its own, faced with the unified testimony of the miners, the farmers, and Maria Luce, and presented with Black Eagle's meticulous records of Beckett's swindles. The territorial judge made a landmark ruling. The gold, recognized as the fruit of exploitation, would not be returned to the railroad's coffers. Instead, it would be used to establish the trust Black Eagle had envisioned. The change was not immediate, but it was real. Lawyers, hired by the trust, began the painstaking work of buying back the water rights to the wells at Agua Dulce and the headwaters of the Cimarron, using Beckett's own greed to undo the damage he had wrought. A portion of the funds was set aside for a new venture, a small schoolhouse to be built on the edge of town, a place where Comanche and Kiowa children could learn to read and write in both their own languages and in English, with Maria Luce, her heart full of a fierce, quiet hope, as its first teacher. The town council, its authority broken, was dissolved. A new election was held, a loud, chaotic, and wonderfully democratic affair. Anton, the big German miner, was elected as its new chairman, his presence a guarantee that the working man would have a voice. And for the first time in the town's history, a Kiowa elder sat on the council, a quiet, dignified man whose presence spoke volumes about the new lines of respect that had been drawn in the dust of the old conflicts. One afternoon, as the sun began its long descent, casting a golden light over the healing land, Naya rode out alone to the twin cottonwoods in Two Ravens Valley. The iron box was gone, but the sense of her father's presence was stronger than ever. She stood beneath the intertwined branches, the place where her journey had taken its most profound turn. She took the string of blue glass beads from around her neck and held them up, letting them catch the light. They were cool and smooth in her hand, a tangible link to the man who had set her on this path. "Father," she whispered, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze, "I chose the people." A smile touched her lips, a real smile, born not of victory but of peace. She turned and saw Elias walking toward her from where he had been waiting with the horses. His arm was in a sling, and he walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were clear and steady. He stopped a few feet from her, and they simply looked at each other, a world of understanding passing between them in the quiet golden light. He had not taken her quest from her. He had helped her fulfill it. The final scene of their story was not written in a blaze of glory, but in the simple, shared work of their hands. They did not leave the West, with its harsh beauty and its painful memories. They stayed. They stayed to be a part of its mending, in the vast, open expanse of the Llano, where the wild horses ran free against the horizon. They built a new watering station. It was a simple structure of stone and timber, built over a spring Naya had shown him. It was not for one people, but for all. For the settler's wagon, the rancher's herd, the nomad's pony. It was a place of replenishment, a testament to the idea that the land's greatest treasures were meant to be shared. As the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of deep orange and purple, they stood together, watching a small herd of pronghorn drink from the new trough. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of sage and clean water. Naya looked out at the endless horizon, at the land that had demanded so much of them, and had, in the end, given them everything that mattered. "If this land needs us," she said, her voice quiet but sure. Elias put his good arm around her, pulling her close. "We are here," he answered. It was not just a statement. It was a promise to the land, and to each other. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.